urgent research needs that we have, information needs for understanding these fire regimes. Uh, really quick romp through some of the ongoing experimental work and some plans that we have for longer term prescribed burning research at Sedgwick. I'm using the term foothill somewhat loosely, but this green zone in this map encompasses most of what we think of as the California foothills, areas below about 3,000 feet that encompass grassland at the drier end through oak woodlands and then coastal sage scrub and up into some chaparral types in the upper end of the foothill zone. It's a zone that is largely privately owned. And so for that reason, we don't have as much of a corpus of research on fire ecology and so forth in these systems as we do in some of the montane systems. Sedgwick is just a great example of a foothill landscape where you have this mosaic of grasslands and oak woodlands and coastal sage scrub. You look uphill into the forest lands of the national forest. I always say in California, you have to drive uphill to get to public lands. So as I say, this kind of landscape is a really important landscape in California, but not nearly as well studied in terms of the prescribed fire. Just to give you some feel for just what we're talking about out at Sedgwick, about a third of the reserve is actually coastal sage scrub and another third of the reserve is annual grasslands. And 20 to 25% of the reserve is oak and foothill pine oak woodlands and savannas. So this is just a fantastic landscape to be thinking about foothill woodland ecology, foothill ecosystem ecology and fire ecology. Historically, you have to say, from what we understand, fire has been quite common in the foothills, but largely started by humans. This map of fire frequency by Jan van Wachtendonk and Dan Kyan sort of tells the story that most of coastal California has very low lightning strike densities. When they do occur, the lightning strike fires can be pretty substantial, but I think that most people would agree that fire management by Native Americans was the main source of ignitions and the main source of fires across these foothill landscapes prehistorically. There was a period between about the middle 1800s and probably the middle 1900s where range management burning was more widespread in the foothills, but our current fire regimes in these systems are largely fire suppression, with very little, most of the fires occur as wildfires under conditions that are basically, they can't be stopped by the fire crews. So when we look at these ecosystems just broadly, the grasslands, the oak woodlands, coastal scrub, the chaparral, let me just give you a quick sense of their fire ecology as we understand it. Upper left, the annual grasslands are quite resilient to fire. They probably were, they're maintained in these foothill woodlands largely due to fire. In the absence of fire, often these grasslands will become shrubbier and shrubbier. And so I think most people think that the expansive grasslands you see over much of, and the oak savannas that you see over much of the foothill woodland zone probably is something of a legacy of past fire regimes. The oak woodlands themselves, when they have this kind of grass understory, tend to support low severity understory burns, and the oaks are quite resistant to damage from these fires, although it will top kill the seedlings and the saplings. But the oak woodlands probably also are relatively fire adapted, fire resilient. Coastal sage scrub is a system that actually is not particularly fire adapted. It can withstand wildfires. It will resprout. There will be seeding of the shrubs back in between fires, but people would say it's not nearly as fire adapted and fire resilient as the chaparral system on the lower right. So if we, and this is really ballparking it, think about the kinds of return intervals, how frequent was fire in these systems, both before European settlement and then post and in the modern era. For grasslands, maybe prehistorically, the 2 to 15 year return interval between fires on grasslands. For oak woodlands, 5 to 15 years. Coastal sage scrub, much less, reconstructed 20 to 100 year intervals between fires. Chaparral, somewhere a couple decades to 75 years. Compared to the modern fire intervals that you see here on the right, which are obviously much longer intervals. Some people talk about this fire deficit in the foothills. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it is true that the systems that we see now are certainly undergoing a lot of change as they're experiencing lower and lower fire frequencies over time. That might be turning around a little bit, certainly in terms of wildfire. There is, I think you all know, an increasing wildfire risk in California. And this just shows on the left kind of state level how the number of the area burned by decade has increased from the 1960s in the green there out to the 2010 to 2017 in the red. So we certainly had an increase. There are lots of reasons for this. There are more humans in California setting more fires. We have climate change, and we have some fire suppression efforts that have basically tended to promote larger fires when they do occur. So just to zoom in on the right to the Sedgwick area, Sedgwick's there, that little blue polygon you can see in the middle of the map on the right. And this is just to show you again, this notion of where the fires are occurring. Most of them are on the federal lands, which is those hatched areas. Most of them are big chaparral fires. When you look down into the foothill zone, there's really not that much fire in the foothill zone because the fires are very actively suppressed. When you think about the wildfires compared to prescribed fires in California, prescribed fires are a tiny fraction of the area burned in any given year, less than 1%. This shows all the prescribed burns between 1990 and 2019 that are in the CAL FIRE database. And then again, a zoom in on the Sedgwick region where the purple polygons you see there on the right map are the prescribed burns that have occurred over the last, in this case, 20 years. You'll see there again, Sedgwick is the blue polygon, and we'll come back to that one little area right next to Sedgwick. But prescribed burning it actually was more common back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s than it is now. And one of the things that's diminished is the amount of range improvement burning on private ranches. So this is just another quick view to give you some sense of the fire history around the Sedgwick area. And so the big wildfires are shown in red and orange and yellow. That's just the date, the decade when they occurred. And the prescribed burns are in blue. You can see Sedgwick has not had a lot of fires. In fact, the only significant fire was the 2007, what was called the Sedgwick fire. It was actually started by a downed power line to the east of the reserve and then burned into the reserve. And then there's a little bit of the controlled burn that you see over on the western edge of Sedgwick, the Spalding and Midland prescribed burn that did come into Sedgwick, but it didn't burn more than 10 or 15 acres. And so Sedgwick has largely been without fire for decades, if not a century or longer, over most of the landscape. And the big fires that are surrounding us tend to be those big chaparral burns and shrubland burns on the federal lands. Prescribed fires changing a bit in California because we've had such an uptick in wildfire burning. There's been more and more kind of a resurgence of interest in using prescribed burning as one of the tools in the toolbox for managing fire risk, particularly for managing wildfire severity. If you can keep the fuel loads down, they're easier to control the spread of fires, and the fires, when they do occur, are not quite as severe. So you'll see here on the upper right between 2013 and 2018, the increase, I'm using RX just to say prescription burns that have been implemented and versus those that have been planned. It kind of goes step in step with the acres burned in terms of the resources available for this kind of prescribed burning. So the lower graph, this is from a paper by Rebecca Miller and others, shows that in the solid heavy blue line, the area burned in California between 2000 and 2018. And then a lower dashed blue line that you see there is the number of introduced bills in the California legislature that have something to do with prescribed burning. And one of the most significant bills was certainly Senate Bill 901 that was provided about $35 million a year for prescribed burning and $1 billion over 5 years to CAL FIRE for various kinds of fire management. So as I say, there is maybe some indication that prescribed burning is beginning to increase again around the state relatively deliberately as part of a fire management strategy. As we think about that and we start thinking about bringing prescribed burns into the foothill zone in particular, there are some things we need to know. It would be great to have information that you can't get when you study wildfires. Wildfires, you don't know what was there in much detail prior to the burn, you just have the after the fact kind of ability to study, where if you have experimental or prescribed burning, you can characterize the pre-burn conditions, relate them to the fire behavior, and relate the fire behavior to post-burn conditions. It's a really important part of understanding fire ecology. We can think more experimentally and deliberately about the role of grazing and browsing and how that affects fire behavior and outcomes. We can think about soils. We can think about very practical kinds of management concerns, like what are the implications of different fuel break designs, because prescribed burning is accompanied by fuel breaks to sort of dice the area up into safe burn units. We need to understand more the relationship between public perception and understanding of fire and the reintroduction of prescribed burning or managed burns into the landscapes we live in. There's a lot to be understood in terms of how much we're really mitigating wildfire risks, the costs and benefits of different kinds of prescribed burning approaches. And all of this is sort of the nature of the prescribed burning program through time. How frequently do you burn? What season do you burn? And so forth. So we have a lot that we need to understand a lot more about. The picture on the right is actually of that's David Ackerley, some of you may know from UC Berkeley in the foreground in the blue shirt. And looking at foothill woodland burn at the Pepperwood Preserve. They burned twice in the last 5 years. That's a place where, again, it was wildfires. They didn't have as much information as they wanted, but at least they had some pre-burn vegetation data that helped them at least quantify some of the impacts of burning there. But we'd really like to be more experimental in our approach. So with that in mind, Santa Barbara County's fire department has been thinking about the sort of bringing prescribed fire through the foothills of the San Rafael Mountains, including places like the Spalding Ranch and the Midland School burn units, which were burned 20 years ago. And then parts of Sedgwick as well. And they see Sedgwick as being a place that has a lot of fuel accumulation and where there would be some opportunities to try to reduce the risk of severe wildfire. So I'll talk about 3 particular areas. The annual grasslands on the east there, the burn units in the southwest, and then the Spalding Ranch and Midland burn units. And what we're doing here is trying to think about, kind of aligning our scientific research needs and our management interests with Santa Barbara County's interest in prescribed burning for public health and public safety. And so to do this takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of kind of team science and team coordinated work. And so this has been an effort of UCSB's NRS office, Marianne Whitman and others, the Lacretz Center, Santa Barbara County Fire Department, UC Cooperative Extension. We'll be building up a nice set of collaborating faculty, researchers, and students on campus. And we couldn't do any of this without the support from Linda Duttenhaver and Morton Lacretz. And Linda really gave this program a shot in the arm in January as she gave us a gift specifically to help support this fire research program. So thank you, Linda. This is just really quickly some of the people involved. As I say, we're kind of growing a nice, healthy collaboration between people with very different kind of research specialties and interests, graduate students, faculty. I really want to acknowledge the Sedgwick Reserve staff. They've been fantastic in working with us on this. And Vince LaRocco, Santa Barbara County Fire Department, Gina Batala at Midland School, and so forth. You can see the names, but just to give you the sense, this is kind of a team effort here. So let me just give you some sense of the things that have been going on. Hopefully you'll all be out on Sedgwick again sometime soon to see some of this work. And I'll start with the annual grassland burn that was over in Eastern Figueroa Canyon last fall, and the one that's coming up this spring. So this is a project that Matthew Shapiro brought to us funded by the Rustiki Endowment, Matthew and his co-PI Roxanne Foss. And they were specifically interested in the problem of the relationship between fire behavior and cattle grazing intensity. The notion being that different kinds of grazing systems might actually reduce the risk of high severity fires or fires that are spreading rapidly. So with those questions in mind, they came to Sedgwick. They were going to do this at Henry Wong on the upper right photo here. In the little plots, you see the little strips are the plots that they are using in a series of burns around the state. But we expanded this question about grazing and fire behavior to a much larger area of several acres, where we created a set of strips that were then mowed and raked different levels of residual dry matter to simulate different levels of grazing intensity. And you can see Liza on the tractor providing lanes that are fuel-free in between our strips just for fire safety. You can see the fire crews during the burn day starting one of those strips on fire. And then the lower right, you can see sort of the, after a morning of burning all those strips, what the place looked like. This is an easier way to see it. Actually, Mark Mays, who's I think with us today, is a drone pilot. And he's been flying drone imagery across all these burns. And so this is what it looked like in October 2020 before the burn. You can see our experimental strips that have been manipulated to different residual dry matter levels. This is just getting underway here on burn morning in October. And you can see the fire crews. You can see one of the actively burning strips down in the lower part of the screen there, and some strips that have already burned. They were kind of burned as a succession of different strips. And then close to the end of the burning day, several hours later, you can see some of the strips didn't even burn all the way, but we had a pretty interesting set of results across these different experimental burn units. I'll just show you one example of a result. We're still doing a lot of the workup of the data, but if you ask the question, what's the relationship between grazing intensity and flame height? We were burning during relatively modest conditions here, low winds, less than 5 miles an hour, high humidities, around 40%. So really pretty modest burn conditions. But even under that, when there's no grazing at all in our ungrazed grasslands, we had flame heights, and these bars are showing the frequency of flame heights. So those are in percentages of our flame estimates on the x-axis, and then the flame height class in centimeters on the y. So basically, when there was no fuel removed, no RDM removed, we had many of our flame heights getting up over 4 feet, which is kind of a critical threshold for firefighters. Once it gets above that height, it gets much harder for them to actually attack the flaming front. And then as you move from light to moderate to heavy grazing, you can see our flame heights got lower. And in the last two classes, there really wasn't much difference between the heavy grazing manipulation and the moderate grazing. That's just to give you a feel for the kinds of information we're developing out of these experimental burns. One of the cool things that Mark's been doing is flying a multispectral drone instrument or drone-borne instrument across these sites. So he's able to model out what the residual dry matter is. This is essentially dry biomass on the ground, or a characterization of the fuel, in more detail. And so this shows you, for example, his drone-based mapping of the residual dry matter across that first fall burn unit. And that's turning out to line up nicely with some of our other fire behavior metrics like rate of spread. This is what the place looked like in January. This is what it looks like on the ground. I'm calling it the Sedgwick Fairway at this point. But we'll continue to monitor the recovery of this area. Those sticks that you see in there, by the way, are the ways we measured rate of spread. We actually had people observing the fire as it progressed from 10 meters, one stick to the next stick, 10 meters up the hill. We have a second of these burns planned for somewhere around late May to early June this year, weather permitting and all the other conditions applying. But it'll be essentially a replication of that same first burn that we did in the fall. We'll do it under spring conditions and see if we can learn something about differences in seasonality of grassland burning with the same fuel treatments. And a lot more collaborators on board with this one as well. So now let me just quickly turn to another different kind of a burn landscape, which is up on the Spalding Ranch and the Midland School burn units that were burned 20 years ago. They were slated to be burned last fall. They're scheduled to be burned this fall now. And this is what that landscape looks like, quite different, mosaic of coastal sage scrub and oak woodland, not unlike some of what you see at Sedgwick. And the Midland School was nice enough to let several of us on the property to actually put in some pre-burn data last fall. And so this is just to give you a real quick feel for it. That's Mark Mays on the lower photograph on the right, and PhD student Kylie Brand on the left. Mark's holding a sign in the upper left just showing one of our transects through blue oak woodland on the site, and Kylie's in the upper right doing vegetation transects and coastal sage scrub. Lower left, you see Mark flying drone imagery across the site. And then I thought I'd just show you this photo of the what we call pyrometers. Essentially, these are little copper strips where you paint a series of paints on the strip. Each paint has a different melting point. And so you put those strips out into the fire, and it will record the maximum temperature at that location as the fire passes over, including on vertical posts like the one in the upper left that you see there with Mark standing by, where we have an arrangement of, or a series of strips to try to get the temperature changes with height and during the fire. One of the nice things that we're doing with these woodland and coastal scrub burns is actually taking advantage of LiDAR, light detection and ranging imagery, which provides a 3D view of the vegetation structure. So you can see here on the upper right, a high resolution LiDAR image that Mark put together. Basically, the colors are associated with the elevation. So the highest points are what you see there are those tree canopies that are emerging up in the red colors, and the lowest are the sort of low stature vegetation down lower in the canyon that are the blue colors. Kind of get a better sense of LiDAR imagery from the image on the lower right, where you can see kind of a slice through this LiDAR imagery, and that shows you the kind of the profile of the blue oak canopy there as the red dots that are all showing you different parts of the elements of the trees as a function of height above the ground. And then you can also see the shrub understory underneath those blue oaks. So this is the kind of information that is just worth its weight in gold for trying to think about fire behavior and the coupling of vegetation structure to fire severity, which is what we're up to in these burns. Finally, let me talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Southwest. There we've been working with Santa Barbara County Fire, Vince LaRocco, and others to think through if they were going to do managed burning and therefore fuel management, how might we take advantage of it for a long-term experimental study of these burns as well. And so there's some preliminary burn units. This is just to show you, this is an area that has not burned in a long time. So you've got relatively mature, thick coastal sage scrub in a mosaic with coast live oak and blue oak woodlands. Santa Barbara County has already been in and has been maintaining a set of fuel breaks across much of that area. So this is an example of a freshly bladed fuel break in the zone. And we've been deploying wildlife cameras as well. We've got a nice set of them out across that landscape now, because one of the interesting questions will be, how does wildlife use of this area change for the burn as you have all these sort of burn preparation activities, and then following the burn during burn vegetation recovery, how do these animals use the landscape under those different eras? So our next steps in all of this, we're collecting baseline data across Sedgwick in that southwest corner and in the grassland burn that's planned for the spring. We're finalizing a vegetation management plan that is needed for permitting and approval processes to do this kind of prescribed burning in California, working with the county fire department. And then this larger group of faculty and students and researchers are all putting heads together to think about the sort of final experimental design for really a long-term experimental burning program at Sedgwick. So it's a really exciting time to be thinking about all of this out at the reserve. So I'll stop there. Hopefully you've got a little sense of what we're up to, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will stop sharing my screen so I can see you all and listen to you. Thanks for your attention.
All right, thanks for that, Frank. And we have a couple of questions that came in. The first one from Dennis Beebe. He said, remind us of the difference between scrub and chaparral.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So we talked about coastal sage scrub or soft chaparral, it's sometimes called, is more of a drought deciduous kind of shrub. It's softer leaves, it's a more open canopy, it's a little bit lower stature, that's associated with the drier sites that are at lower elevations or drier aspects in the landscape. Chaparral, by comparison, is an evergreen shrub with hard waxy leaves, tends to be a denser canopy with more biomass above the ground, and tends to have much more severe fire as well as a result of that. So chaparral, a little wetter, greener, thicker coastal scrub, a little drier sites, more open, not as fire adapted as chaparral. So the key species at Sedgwick in terms of coastal scrub would be the California sagebrush and the purple sage. You see a lot of it out there at Sedgwick. It's called the Venturan coastal sage scrub.
Thanks for that. We've got a few more questions from Dennis. If you have questions, type them into the chat box or raise your hand and we'll call on you. So Dennis's other questions, he was wondering on the spectra slide that you showed what the units corresponding to the colors were. I don't know if you're able to pull that back up or.
So this was on the drone-based image, Dennis, is that what you're talking about? Yeah, that's RDM, and I believe, Mark, you can correct me, but I think that's usually measured in pounds per acre is what we're talking about there. So basically what we did was on the ground, clip and weigh a series of these residual dry matter samples and use those samples to calibrate against a set of vegetation indices. And so measure on the ground pounds per acre, estimated from the imagery pounds per acre.
All right, and I like this next question, is describe how a rancher might use the results of your program. Big one.
So I think for the grassland burns, one of the questions is, to what extent is the degree of residual dry matter that you're leaving on the ground going to affect the fire behavior during that year's fire season? And so one of the things, and that's not necessarily the only thing a rancher is thinking about. Clearly, they are in the business of producing beef. But if you are a range manager and you are thinking about cattle as a management tool as well for fire. This gives you a chance to look at what levels of grazing are associated with what kinds of mitigation of fire risk. And in this, what we found so far in this particular example was you get a pretty big step increase in fire rate of spread and flame lengths and so forth if you don't graze at all. But you get pretty dramatic reductions in fire spread rates and height, even with moderate grazing, much less more heavy grazing. There is I would say, and this is something Matthew Shapiro really is our kind of expert on. He's the co-op extension range advisor for Santa Barbara County and Ventura County, who's been working with this. And they're trying to do this in a way that informs how cattle can be used, not just for range improvement, but also for fire management across California foothills.
One of the questions that would be interesting to add, to fold into this Ristici design, is geared less for cattle ranchers, which I know it's their studies, so it makes sense that it would be an evaluation of grazing, which is actually removing the biomass. But an interesting question for homeowners who mow and cut their grass but don't collect that grass, leave it on the ground, would be if the rate of spread or the flame intensity would have been as high if it had been cut but left on the ground. And that isn't something that our study looked at in the fall.
Correct. Yeah. So as Kate's pointing out, when we were trying to simulate grazing, that involved mowing, but then raking off the thatch in the same way that cows would be removing the grass. One thing that will differ between the spring and the fall is there a lot of that, if you mow in the spring, a lot of that thatch will break down actually it'll compact up against the soil surface, it'll break down under the sunlight and so forth. And there'll be a lot less of it in the fall. So timing might be kind of an important consideration, Kate, in terms of that. And it'd be interesting to think about that with a spring burn in particular.
Okay, so what other questions do you all have about this research project or about fire ecology? If anyone wants to either raise your hand or unmute yourself. And
if you have questions just about prescribed burning in general and its use in California, let's talk.
I had a question about the fire map that you showed that showed historic prescribed burning in Santa Barbara County, that there's quite a bit of pink to the south of Sedgwick. Do you know specifically where those areas were prescribed burned?
Yeah, there was one large burn in particular that's over just to the east of Lake Cachuma on the Lazaro area. So the Lazaro, that was a big vegetation management plan burn that showed up in the map. And the other quite large unit is the Spalding Midland burn. The other places the county has been burning include places out in the Los Alamos Valley, like the RM Ranch is another place where they've been burning quite a bit. So, I think they have resources at this point. There are some ranchers who are still quite interested in range improvement burns, as well as working with the county on vegetation management planning. So we might actually have a little bit more in our landscape than other parts of other foothill landscapes in California.
Great. It looked like Gloria, you had a question.
Yeah, I did have a question. Was part of the reason you're going over to the Midland school site and looking at that Spalding Midland burn was comparing the mosaic? Like, were there finer pieces, the part that had the prescribed burn pretty recently? Or 20?
Yeah, hi Gloria. That's interesting. Actually, when we first started, it wasn't with the question in mind of a repeat burn 20 years later. It was more that we were interested in moving some of our fire studies and prescribed fires into that coastal scrub and oak woodland system. And that was going to happen before Sedgwick. So we thought this is a great place to test some of our approaches out at Midland before we go kind of full scale in Sedgwick. It's surprising how little we actually know about oak woodland fire behavior. So that was one thing we were really interested there, was that some of those oaks have a grass understory, some of them have a shrub understory. It gives you a chance to think about how different 3D structures in those oak woodlands might lead to different outcomes for the oaks themselves. So that's one of the questions we were interested in. But it was partly just, you know, it was the first burn in line. Midland was really cooperative and really nice to let us on to actually deploy some of our instruments and so forth. And so we staged our first set of studies there.
Okay. One more question. When I was in school in the 80s, it seemed like there was a lot of research going on, or maybe not research, but there would seem like there were a lot of prescribed burns going on. The Forest Service, for example.
Yeah. So if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was more prescribed burning going on then than there is now. We're just seeing this sort of resurgence.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was range improvement burns that used to be more widespread. I think it's actually harder to do prescribed burning at this point in some ways because of all of the prescription restrictions. You know, the biggest barrier to prescribed burning right now is our climate. There's only very short prescription windows where everything lines up in terms of air quality and temperature and humidities and fuel moistures to actually do these things. And if anything, those prescription windows have gotten smaller, narrower through time, particularly because of the air quality concerns.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I think we were burning 50 to 60,000 acres a year prescribed burns in the early 80s. We're burning 15,000 acres a year now by comparison. Yeah.
Bob Altavilla, you've had your hand up for a while. And you're on mute.
Yeah, okay, I had a question. I know there are various fire breaks plowed all over the mountains in different areas. Have we learned anything about maybe planting fire-resistant species in those fire breaks that might actually slow the fire down more than just a dirt trail?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Bob. I'm probably not the right person to ask about that. Carla D'Antonio, who's one of our collaborators on this, has actually been looking at that question a bit more in detail. But it seems that my sense is when the fuel breaks as they're currently built, you know, they're bladed out, generally down to bare soil, tend to be colonized by weeds unless you put a lot of work into reseeding them. And if they do reseed them, they tend to reseed them with kind of cover crops almost. I mean, you know, where they have lots of grass seeds and they can reseed them with grass. That is going to get weedy again, and it's going to build up fuels again unless it's somehow maintained, whether it's, and so there's discussion about how to use ungulates, goats, and sheep. We tried that in the past on different fuel breaks. That's one way to do it. But the notion of sort of large scale planting more fire resistant plants, I'm not aware of anybody doing that, but please correct me if I'm wrong. If people know of one, because I'd be interested to hear about it. It would be a big project, just given the amount of area that would have to be seeded or planted.
Right.
We're sorry, go ahead, Bob.
I was just thanking him for answering. Thank you.
I'm wondering, Frank, if you can talk for just a minute about some of the challenges of doing research and on planning these prescribed burns. Seen some of that.
Well, as you might imagine, people who are doing experimental ecology would love to have everything under their control, right? You know exactly what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. And when you do prescribed burning and you're working with agencies that have their own constraints, it's always a bit of luck whether the burn comes off when you thought it was going to, and so forth. So I've done, in the past, I worked in chaparral prescribed burns a bit, and I set up and did a lot of work on 4 different prescribed burn experiments, and only 2 of them ever came off. 2, one at La Purísima and one out on Vandenberg, but the other 2 that were with the Forest Service never happened. So that's always one risk, is that you're going to put a lot of work into all your pre-burn effort, and then the fates conspire against you and you never hit the prescription window and the burn never happens the way you thought it would. That's just the risk that you take. The flip side, though, is when the burns do occur, the information is incredibly valuable. You get information you can't get any other way in terms of understanding things like the relationship between the plant communities on the site, the fire behavior, the post-burn communities, and so forth. It's just really terrific when it does happen. And the places that do this well, the long-term experimental burning at the field stations around the US, it's amazing how much they've learned, how much they've accelerated their understanding of fire ecology with these long-term experimental burn programs. I'll just mention one that I worked on for a couple of years out in Manhattan, Kansas, the Konza Prairie, where they've been for 4 decades manipulating the fire return interval, bison grazing versus cattle grazing across watershed-sized units across that landscape. And they have learned some things about tall grass prairie ecology and oak woodland ecology. You're just so jealous that we don't know that here in California.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think one of my first days out here was a day that the Ristici burn was planned for, and seeing the whole research crew out, everyone ready. And then at the last minute, it was postponed. Sort of seeing the planning that goes in and the flexibility. So
yeah, I mean, my quip, and I'm exaggerating when I say this, is that it always feels like a Hail Mary pass. You know, you get it all set up, you just throw the Hail Mary pass, and if somebody catches it, if it actually works out, score. But if it doesn't, well, yeah, come back next year.
I think, Dennis, you had another question?
Yeah, I don't know. I was surprised to see the difference in fire interval between like maybe prehistory and today, or pre-European versus today. I'm surprised it's longer in general, because I would think there's a lot more people and a lot more people making mistakes. And I don't quite understand all the ingredients that make the interval even longer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. So there's plenty of ignitions. I guess you could say the more people equals more ignitions, whether it's accidental, a lot of them along roadsides and so forth, and land areas where you can get ignitions to catch. But we also, particularly in the foothill zone, we jump on those fires as ASAP and try to put them out. And the only place where you start to see a real increase in fire is more down in Southern California, when they have all the ignitions, plus those really high wind events, the Santa Ana events and so forth. And there you're starting to see maybe we're starting to get more fire than we even had historically in some parts of Southern California. Up in our area, it seems that we're still basically, especially in the foothills, doing more suppression, even though we have more ignitions. And that on balance, that means there's fewer acres burned these landscapes than there were historically.
Is there any other?
That could be changing. The fire season is changing, weather's changing. The multi-year droughts changed the game quite a bit in terms of the fuel properties. So we'll see, but that's why I think people are spending a lot of time thinking about managing through prescribed burns, anticipating higher and higher fire risk in these systems.
Are there any questions from anyone else out there? This has been great. All right.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I would like to
Everyone.
thank Frank for coming out, and thank you all for coming out and sharing the lunch hour with us. It's been great to see some of you, tell you a little bit about the exciting work that's underway, and I hope some of you will come out with our trail work days coming up soon. So thanks for everything, and we'll see you soon. Bye.